There is a place on earth where two great rivers cut through an otherwise dry and unforgiving land, the Tigris and the Euphrates. At the meeting point of these powerful waters, a remarkable story began, not with monuments or fireworks, but with mud, sweat, and the burning will to survive. That place, the land between the rivers, was given a name by the ancient Greeks, Mesopotamia, meaning between two rivers. But it was far more than just a location. It was the cradle of civilization, the first place where humanity not only lived, but began to build a world. Today, this region lies within Iraq and parts of Syria and Turkey. It's hot, dusty, and dry. But over 5,000 years ago, it was something else entirely, a fertile floodplain, enriched every year by the overflowing rivers. With each flood, the rivers brought fresh soil, feeding crops, and offering a promise. The promise that people might finally stop wandering and settle. But Mesopotamia wasn't gentle. Unlike the calm and predictable Nile of Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded without warning, often violently. They could destroy a year's worth of crops in a single day. Yet it was in this struggle, this constant negotiation with nature, that something extraordinary emerged. The early people of Mesopotamia didn't just endure nature, they learned to shape it. They dug canals, built dikes, and created irrigation systems to tame the rivers. In doing so, they began to control time itself, deciding when to plant, when to harvest, and how to survive. From that moment on, humans were no longer merely reacting to the world. They were organizing it. And with that control came the great transformation. No longer needing to chase after food, people began to settle. They planted wheat and barley, raised goats and sheep, and built houses from mud bricks. Villages formed, villages grew, and for the first time in history, cities were born. Eridu, Uruk. These weren't just clusters of huts. They were bustling communities. People took on different roles: farmers, potters, traders, priests. They built temples. They traded goods. They told stories, honored gods, and, most importantly, they began to write. That moment, the invention of writing, changed everything. At first, it was simple: marks on wet clay to keep track of grain or sheep. But soon, those wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, became more than accounting. They became contracts, records, prayers, and eventually, stories. For the first time, human thought had memory. Ideas could travel through time. But writing was just one of many firsts in Mesopotamia. Here, people developed organized agriculture. They created the first division of labor. They built enormous stepped temples called ziggurats, dedicated to the gods who ruled the sky, water, and wind. Each city had its own guardian deity. Religion wasn't separate from life. It was the very structure of it. They tracked the stars, observed the moon, and built one of the earliest lunar calendars to predict the seasons and guide their planting. They created laws, resolved disputes, and formed councils. They created schools to teach scribes. They formed the building blocks of government, law, trade, and science. And all of this began with water and mud and fire. Mesopotamia was a land of contrasts: wild nature and brilliant order, violent floods and precise calendars, barren desert and thriving fields. It was a place where struggle and innovation walked hand in hand, and where humanity first dared to shape the world with its own hands. This wasn't just a place to live, it was a place to create. And what they created, cities, writing, religion, law, still echoes in the modern world today. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The clang of metal tools, the chants of temple priests, the scratching of a reed stylus on clay. These were the sounds of people building something lasting. Not just buildings, but a future. When the sun rose over the Mesopotamian plains, its light didn't just touch fields of golden grain. It illuminated the first great cities of the world. Cities built not from conquest, but from cooperation, curiosity, and the endless human desire to improve life. And then, in the heart of this sacred land, one extraordinary people rose to prominence. They were the Sumerians, not just farmers or builders, but record keepers of history, architects of the sky, poets of the unknown. Their cities would grow into centers of learning, trade, and myth. Their voices, etched into clay, would echo across millennia. But that is a story for another chapter. Between two rivers, humanity did not simply survive, it dreamed. And in that dream, it planted the seeds of civilization itself. After taming the rivers and learning to work the land, humanity took its first bold step towards something far greater: civilization. And leading that step were a remarkable people, the Sumerians. They did not call themselves by that name. Sumerians is what we call them today. But what they built, what they imagined, what they wrote and worshipped, all of it became the foundation of everything we now call civilization. Around 3000 BCE, the southern plains of Mesopotamia bloomed with cities: Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, names that would echo across time. These weren't villages or towns. They were organized, bustling city-states, each with its own ruler, its own gods, and its own unique way of life. And at the heart of these cities stood something awe-inspiring: the ziggurat. These towering temples, made of sun-dried bricks, rose in steps toward the heavens. From a distance, they looked like mountains made by human hands. Each ziggurat was dedicated to a city's patron deity: Inanna, Enlil, Anu, or Enki. It wasn't just a temple. It was the spiritual and political center of city life, a symbol of the link between heaven and earth. The Sumerians believed the gods had shaped humanity from clay and placed them on earth to serve divine will. In return for protection and guidance, humans were to care for the land, offer prayers, and keep order. Priests, dressed in elaborate robes, bearing incense and chants, maintained this balance between mortals and immortals. But the Sumerians were not just spiritual. They were deeply practical, innovative, and astonishingly organized. They invented one of the most complex writing systems the world had ever seen: cuneiform. Using a reed stylus, they pressed wedge-shaped symbols into clay tablets. At first, it was simple: numbers, names, lists. But over time, it evolved into a system that could record laws, stories, treaties, prayers, songs, poems, and even medical prescriptions. And from this script came the first known work of literature in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a sweeping tale of kingship, friendship, love, loss, and the quest for immortality. It reflects the deepest questions of the human soul, questions that still resonate today. Who are we? Why do we die? What makes a life meaningful? Gilgamesh, a legendary king of Uruk, sets out to find eternal life, only to return with the understanding that legacy, not immortality, is the true measure of a man. But literature was just one part of their brilliance. The Sumerians were master builders and engineers. They designed irrigation systems, roadways, granaries, workshops, and even early forms of plumbing. They created the first known legal codes, long before Hammurabi, laws that governed trade, marriage, inheritance, and property. They used a base 60 number system, which gave us the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, and a legacy in mathematics that persists to this day. In schools called edubas, young boys learned to read, write, and calculate. They studied grammar, multiplication tables, and copied long passages of epic texts. These schools produced the world's first scribes, highly trained individuals who served kings, priests, merchants, and courts. Women, while largely in domestic roles, could own property, run businesses, and even serve as priestesses. In some cities, goddesses were worshipped as central deities, most notably Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. Daily life in Sumer was rich and complex. Markets bustled with traders selling grain, dates, textiles, fish, and pottery. Farmers worked the land in rhythm with the seasons. Craftsmen shaped metal, carved statues, and made intricate jewelry from lapis lazuli and gold. Musicians played lyres and drums in celebrations and rituals, and throughout it all, people looked up to the stars. The Sumerians were early astronomers. They mapped constellations, tracked planetary movements, and connected celestial patterns to earthly events. Their sky gazing would eventually shape calendars, farming schedules, and religious festivals, and later influence Babylonian, Greek, and even modern astronomy. But even the greatest cities faced challenges. Floods still came. Wars between city-states broke out. Kings rose and fell. Yet through the chaos, the Sumerians left behind something no war could destroy: knowledge. On clay tablets, thousands of them, they recorded the beating heart of their civilization. And centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Uruk, Lagash, and Ur, they also uncovered our shared origin. The Sumerians didn't just build cities. They built systems, stories, and structures that still shape us. They taught us that civilization is more than survival. It's about meaning, memory, creativity, and connection. And perhaps, most importantly, they showed us what it means to be human, to rise with the sun, to worship what we don't fully understand, to record what we've learned, to dream of eternity, and to pass something on to those who come after. That is the Sumerian legacy. And in the next chapter, we'll see what happened when a new city rose to power, one that would shine even brighter, guided by law, beauty, and ambition. That city was Babylon, in the land between the rivers. The Sumerians built more than just walls and temples. They built the first blueprint of human civilization, where justice was carved in stone and dreams reached the heavens. Long after the Sumerians carved their marks into clay, and after their cities faded into dust, a new light rose on the Mesopotamian plains, a city that would come to symbolize both order and imagination, power and beauty. That city was Babylon. More than just a place, Babylon became a legend. It was a city of gates and gardens, of gods and kings, of stone laws and stories etched into the sky. Situated along the banks of the Euphrates River, in what is now modern-day Iraq, Babylon would rise and rise again to become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. But Babylon didn't begin as a grand empire. In its earliest days, around 2300 BCE, it was a modest settlement, overshadowed by older cities like Ur and Kish. Yet, its location gave it power. It sat at the crossroads of trade and conquest, a place where goods, ideas, and armies all passed through. And then came a man who would change everything. Hammurabi, ruling around 1792 BCE, King Hammurabi was more than a conqueror. He was a visionary. Under his leadership, Babylon expanded its territory, unifying much of Mesopotamia under one rule. But his true legacy was not in land, it was in law. Hammurabi created the world's first major written legal code, a detailed public declaration of rules and consequences. It was carved into a tall basalt stone, known today as the Code of Hammurabi, and placed in the heart of the city where all could see it. The message was clear. Justice was no longer in the hands of the powerful alone. There would be standards. There would be accountability. The laws covered everything from trade and theft to marriage, inheritance, labor, and even medical malpractice. Some were harsh by modern standards. An eye for an eye is perhaps the most famous, but at their core was an idea both radical and timeless, that a society must be built on fairness, structure, and the rule of law. This idea made Babylon not just a capital of politics, but of principles. But Babylon was not only a place of order. It was a city of wonder. The streets were wide and carefully planned. Canals ran through neighborhoods, connecting homes and marketplaces. Temples rose high above the rooftops, especially the great Esagila, dedicated to the chief god Marduk, the protector of Babylon, and towering above all, according to ancient sources, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, described as lush terraces of greenery, stacked like steps toward the sky. The gardens were said to have been built by King Nebuchadnezzar II for his queen, who missed the mountains of her homeland. Though historians still debate their existence, the legend alone has captured imaginations for centuries. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled in the 6th century BCE, Babylon reached its golden age. The city was reborn in splendor. He rebuilt temples, walls, and palaces, He constructed the massive Ishtar Gate, glazed in brilliant blue tiles, decorated with lions, dragons, and bulls, symbols of power and protection. Passing through the Ishtar Gate, travelers would enter a world of music, sculpture, astronomy, and mathematics. Babylon became a center of learning and science. Priests and scholars studied the stars, recorded lunar cycles, tracked eclipses, and laid the foundations for modern astronomy. They also divided time, creating a system of hours, minutes, and seconds, rooted in the Sumerian-based 60 mathematics, but refined and applied to the cosmos. In Babylon, religion, science, and governance were deeply connected. The movement of the stars wasn't just knowledge, it was fate. Kings ruled with divine authority, but were also bound by sacred oaths and ceremonial rituals. Festivals, especially the New Year celebration called Akitu, were grand events that renewed both royal power and cosmic balance. But Babylon's greatness was not eternal. Like all empires, it faced decline. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, conquered the city in 539 BCE. Yet Cyrus did not destroy it. In fact, he honored Babylon's gods, respected its traditions, and allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. For a time, Babylon even thrived under Persian rule. Later came Alexander the Great, who dreamed of making Babylon the capital of his global empire. He died there, too young, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And after his death, Babylon slowly faded, its walls crumbling, its gardens vanishing, its temples swallowed by time. But the spirit of Babylon never disappeared. Its ideas traveled through Persia, Greece, Rome, and eventually to us. The concept of written laws, the dream of planned cities, the use of science to understand the stars, the belief that human beings could shape not just their homes, but the very rules that govern life. Today, when we write laws, build cities, or look up at the stars, we are, in some small way, walking in the footsteps of Babylon. In Babylon, justice was carved into stone, gardens rose into the sky, and time itself was measured by the stars. It was a city not just of kings, but of dreams. When fear was a weapon and power knew no bounds. Long before Rome, long before the Mongols, there was a kingdom that ruled with unmatched ferocity. A land where discipline, war, and terror were sharpened into tools of conquest. That land was Assyria, rising from the northern plains of Mesopotamia along the upper Tigris River. The Assyrians began as humble farmers and traders. But by the second millennium BCE, they had transformed into something far more formidable. The first true military empire the world had ever seen. Where Babylon built with law and wonder, Assyria built with iron and fire. At its height, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, from the mountains of modern-day Iran to the sands of Egypt. It was a vast, complex machine, ruled not by diplomacy or faith, but by sheer power and ruthless efficiency. How did they do it? The answer lies in one word: fear. The Assyrians understood that terror was not just a side effect of war. It was a weapon. Their armies didn't just conquer, they destroyed. Cities were burned, walls torn down, fields salted, populations Deported, heads of rebels were stacked at city gates as warnings. Entire regions surrendered at the mere rumor that Assyria was coming. But this fearsome reputation was no accident. It was carefully crafted and maintained by a long line of warrior kings who ruled not just with swords, but with strategy. Among them, one name stands tallest: Ashurnasirpal II. Ruling in the 9th century BCE, he launched brutal campaigns that redefined warfare. He used iron weapons, siege towers, battering rams, tools far ahead of their time. He proudly recorded his victories on palace walls and stone steles, boasting not just of battles won, but of enemies flayed, impaled, and paraded in chains. To the Assyrians, war was sacred, a duty assigned by their chief god, Ashur. And so, conquest wasn't just about territory. It was a divine mission. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, the empire became a web of vassal states, tribute routes, and fortified cities. Provinces were reorganized, rebellions were crushed, deportations, massive forced relocations of entire populations, became standard policy. These weren't random acts of cruelty, but calculated efforts to prevent uprisings and dilute local loyalties. And yet, the Assyrians were not merely destroyers. Beneath the iron fist was a mind of order and ambition. They built roads, postal systems, and an intelligence network, early versions of what we might call bureaucracy. They organized one of the most efficient standing armies in the ancient world, with ranks of infantry, cavalry, engineers, and charioteers. Their cities, Nimrud, Dur-Sharukin, and especially Nineveh, became centers of administration, engineering, and culture. Massive palaces rose from the earth, decorated with intricate stone reliefs, showing scenes of hunting, battle, and divine power. But it was in Nineveh that Assyria left behind perhaps its greatest treasure, the library of Ashurbanipal. King Ashurbanipal, unlike many of his brutal predecessors, was a scholar as well as a soldier. In the 7th century BCE, he gathered thousands of clay tablets from across Mesopotamia, preserving myths, legal codes, medical texts, omens, hymns, and epics. Among them was the oldest surviving copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Library of Ashurbanipal was the first true library in human history, a gift of knowledge hidden within an empire built on power. But even the strongest walls eventually crumble. By the late 600s BCE, the Assyrian Empire had stretched itself too thin. Years of warfare, rebellion, and internal strife weakened the great machine. Enemies once scattered now found common cause. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes rose up, marching toward the heart of the empire. In 612 BCE, after a long siege, Nineveh fell. The palaces were looted. The temples burned. The empire, once feared across continents, collapsed into ash and silence. For centuries, the memory of Assyria vanished, buried under desert sands and forgotten ruins. It wasn't until the 19th century that archaeologists unearthed its broken palaces and shattered tablets, revealing a world both magnificent and monstrous. And as we piece together their story today, we are forced to ask, can greatness survive when it is built on fear. The Assyrians gave the world its first glimpse of empire on a truly global scale. They taught us the power of structure, of armies, of information, and engineering. But they also taught us the limits of violence and the fragility of a reign built on intimidation. Their rise was meteoric. Their fall was absolute. And yet, their influence endured. The idea of a professional military, the use of terror as policy, the logistics of managing an empire. All these lessons would be echoed by later civilizations: Persia, Rome, even modern states. Assyria was a fire, brief but blinding. They ruled through fear. They conquered with iron. And in the end, the world remembered both their power and their fall. Where unity was built on respect and roads connected the world, after the fall of Assyria, the lands of Mesopotamia were scarred and shaken. Ash and silence covered the once mighty cities. But from the ruins of conquest, a new power emerged, not forged in fear, but in wisdom, diplomacy, and vision. This was the Persian Empire, the first truly global empire. In history, its founder, Cyrus the Great, would not rule by terror. He would rule by trust. In a world accustomed to brutality, his leadership offered something rare: mercy, order, and an idea that would echo through time, that diversity could be strength. Cyrus rose to power in the mid-6th century BCE, uniting the Medes and Persians. But unlike previous conquerors, when Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BCE, there were no massacres, no temples burned. The city, the crown jewel of Mesopotamia, welcomed him. Why? Because Cyrus respected the people he ruled. He allowed exiled populations to return to their homelands. Most famously, the Jews who had been held in Babylonian captivity. He restored their temples, their gods, their customs. In the Cyrus Cylinder, often called the world's first human rights document, he declared his commitment to justice and religious freedom. This was not weakness. It was strategy and morality. Cyrus knew that an empire ruled by fear could never last, but an empire ruled with tolerance could endure for centuries. Under his successors, Cambyses, Darius I, and Xerxes, the Persian Empire expanded into a vast superpower, stretching from India to Egypt, from the mountains of Central Asia to the shores of the Aegean Sea. But how do you govern a world that large? The answer? Roads. Darius the Great, one of the greatest administrators in history, built a system that connected the empire like never before. The most famous of these was the Royal Road, a highway over 2,700 kilometers long, linking the capital city of Persepolis with Sardis in Anatolia. Mounted couriers could deliver messages across the empire in 7 days, a feat the Greeks would marvel at. To ensure order, Darius divided the empire into satrapies, provinces ruled by local governors, or satraps. Each satrap was accountable to the king, but also enjoyed autonomy. Taxes were standardized, laws were recorded, local customs were respected. This was an empire that understood organization, flexibility, and cultural integration. In the great Persian cities, Persepolis, Susa, Ecbatana, palaces stood tall with majestic columns, adorned with sculptures of lions, bulls, and archers. Reliefs on stone walls showed nobles from every corner of the empire: Ethiopians, Indians, Greeks, Elamites, bringing tribute to the king. It was not just power, it was pageantry with purpose. The Persians practiced the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism, a faith centered on the duality between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and deceit. It taught that life was a constant moral struggle, and that humans had free will to choose their path. Zoroastrianism influenced later Abrahamic religions, with its concepts of judgment, heaven, hell, and the final battle between good and evil. But it also shaped the Persian worldview that rulers had a divine duty to maintain order, known as Asha, not through cruelty, but through just rule. But the empire was not without conflict. The Persians clashed with the Greeks in the famous Greco-Persian Wars, where the might of Persia met the defiance of city-states like Athens and Sparta. Battles like Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis became legends, though Persia failed to conquer all of Greece. Its legacy endured far beyond the battlefield, because Persia, more than any empire before it, understood that unity did not mean uniformity. It embraced cultures. It preserved languages. It let Egyptians worship their gods. Babylonians observe their stars, and Jews rebuild their temples. The empire became a mosaic, not a monolith, and that was its genius. Even the king's title reflected this: King of Kings. He ruled over rulers, not just subjects. The empire was not just Persian, it was multinational. And yet, even the greatest empires are not eternal. By the 4th century BCE, internal struggles and weak leadership made Persia vulnerable. And from the west came a young Macedonian warrior, Alexander the Great, whose ambition knew no bounds. In 330 BCE, he entered Persepolis, the heart of the empire, and burned its palaces in a drunken act of revenge. The flames consumed centuries of art, knowledge, and glory. But not the idea. The spirit of Persia lived on, in Roman law, in Islamic administration, in modern governance. Its roads became trade routes. Its tolerance became a model. Its grandeur inspired poets, kings, and dreamers for millennia. In Persia, the world was not ruled by the sword alone, but by the road, the word, and the open hand. It was an empire built not to destroy differences, but to unite them. When the City of Wonders was reborn in glory and gold, history, like rivers, flows in cycles. And in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, one name always returned, rising like the sun over the desert: Babylon. Once a jewel of law and learning under Hammurabi, Babylon had faded into the shadows as empires rose and fell. Assyrians, Persians, and countless warlords swept through the region. But Babylon would not remain silent. In the 7th century BCE, from the ashes of rebellion and the ruins of empires, Babylon rose again, more powerful, more radiant, and more ambitious than ever before. This rebirth marked the beginning of what historians call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and at its heart stood one man, Nebuchadnezzar Sund. His name echoes through time, not just as a conqueror, but as a builder, a dreamer, and a king who transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from 605 to 562 BCE. Under his leadership, Babylon reached its golden age. But this was no ordinary kingdom. This was an empire carved in stone and glazed in blue, guarded by lions and crowned with one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Let's begin where every traveler in the ancient world would begin, at the Ishtar Gate. As you approached Babylon, the first thing you'd see were towering walls stretching to the horizon, massive, impenetrable, shining with golden reliefs of mythical creatures. Then came the gate, a colossal arch of deep blue, glazed bricks, adorned with rows of golden lions, bulls, and dragons. This was no simple entryway. It was a declaration. You're entering the heart of the world. Passing through the Ishtar Gate, you'd find yourself on the processional way, a wide, sacred road used during religious festivals. The New Year festival, in particular, was a spectacle of divine pageantry, as statues of gods were paraded through the streets to reaffirm the king's power and the city's harmony with the cosmos. But Babylon was not just about glory. It was a city of learning, culture, and innovation. Nebuchadnezzar, like kings before him, understood the importance of temples, both spiritual and political. He restored the legendary Esagila Temple, dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's chief god, and rebuilt the Etemenanke Ziggurat, a towering structure that may have inspired the biblical legend of the Tower of Babel. The ziggurat rose in tiered platforms, reaching toward the heavens. Priests would climb its many steps to make offerings to the gods, to the people. It was not just a temple, it was the axis between earth and sky, between mortals and the divine. But of all the wonders Nebuchadnezzar built, none captured the imagination more than the hanging gardens of Babylon. Described by ancient Greek writers, the gardens were said to rise like a green mountain in the middle of the desert, terraced with trees, flowers, and waterfalls. Legend says Nebuchadnezzar built them for his queen, who longed for the forested hills of her homeland. Whether they truly existed or were the dream of poets and travelers, the idea of the hanging gardens endures as a symbol of beauty, love, and human genius defying nature. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was not just a builder of cities, he was also a builder of empire. He led military campaigns across the region, defeating the Egyptians, expanding Babylonian influence, and famously laying siege to Jerusalem, destroying its temple, and exiling much of the Jewish population to Babylon. This moment, recorded in both Babylonian chronicles and the Bible, marked the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, a painful chapter in Jewish history but also one that led to deep theological and cultural transformation. In Babylon, the Jewish people preserved their identity through writing, reflection, and prayer. Ironically, in exile, they became stronger, and many Jewish traditions that endure today were shaped during this very period, in the heart of a city that tried to break them, but instead became part of their story. Back in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's empire stood tall, but not forever. After his death, the empire weakened. Internal strife, weak kings, and growing external threats left the once mighty Babylon vulnerable. And in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia marched toward the city. But Babylon, so often destroyed by war, did not fall in flames. Cyrus entered peacefully. The priests welcomed him. The walls remained standing, but the empire, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, was over. Still, Babylon would live on. The Persians respected it. The Greeks admired it. Alexander the Great dreamed of making it his capital. When he died there in 323 BCE, the city was already beginning to fade. Over the centuries, the rivers shifted, trade moved, and Babylon slowly returned to dust. But its legacy never faded. Babylon gave us the image of a city not only of power, but of imagination. A city where laws were written, gardens reached the sky, and temples brushed the stars. A city that stood as both a warning and a wonder, a mirror of human ambition at its most brilliant and most fragile. Babylon rose again, not just in bricks and temples, but in dreams. For in every story of greatness and fall, there echoes the name Babylon, where empires were built, not by kings, but by hands, hearts, and clay. History often remembers the names of kings: Sargon, Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar. We speak of temples, conquests, and codes of law. But what of the people, the farmers, scribes, merchants, and mothers? What was life truly like for the everyday men and women of Mesopotamia? To understand Mesopotamia, we must leave the palaces and step into the sun-baked streets, through the markets, past the farms, and into the humble clay brick homes. This was the world where civilization truly lived and breathed. Let's begin with the home. Most Mesopotamians lived in rectangular houses made of mud bricks, a material that was cheap, easy to mold, and abundant. The roofs were flat, often used for sleeping on warm nights or drying produce. Homes were built around a central courtyard where families cooked, worked, and gathered. Inside, there was little furniture, perhaps a clay oven, woven mats, a few storage jars, and oil lamps that lit up the evenings. There was no electricity, of course, no running water, but there was warmth, community, and routine. A typical day began at dawn. Farmers, the backbone of Mesopotamian society, walked to their fields with simple tools: wooden plows, sickles, baskets. They planted barley, wheat, flax, lentils, and dates. Thanks to the irrigation canals from the great rivers, crops flourished, though floods and droughts were always a threat. These farmers did more than just grow food. They provided the surplus that allowed cities to thrive. Without them, There would be no scribes, no kings, no temples. In the cities, traders and artisans filled the markets. You'd find potters shaping clay on spinning wheels, metalworkers hammering bronze tools, and weavers dyeing wool in brilliant colors. Baskets of figs, onions, fish, and spices crowded the stalls. Merchants bartered with copper ingots or small pieces of silver. Prices were written on tablets, deals sealed with handshakes, or sometimes curses. If someone cheated, above them, on the rooftops or temple schools, scribes worked in silence. These were the literate elite, trained in the ancient script of cuneiform. From a young age, boys, and rarely girls, studied hundreds of symbols, learning to record transactions, prayers, contracts, and laws. A single mistake could cost a scribe his job, or worse. But those who mastered the stylus gained power. In Mesopotamia, writing was magic, a way to make thoughts last forever. While men worked, women held the household together. They cooked meals in clay ovens, often stews of lentils or barley, seasoned with garlic, leeks, and herbs. Bread was baked daily. Beer was brewed in large jars. And meat, when affordable, was shared on holy days. Women raised children, cleaned, fetched water, and wove textiles. But many also owned property, ran small businesses, and even served as priestesses in temples. In some city-states, goddesses like Inanna were worshipped as divine equals, giving women a place in both religion and respect. Children played with clay figurines, small carts, and spinning tops. They also learned early, helping in the fields, watching the shop, or starting scribal school before age 10. Life was not easy, but it was full. Religion was ever present. People prayed to a vast pantheon. Enlil, god of air. Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Shamash, god of the sun and justice. Each city had its patron god, and every home had small statues or altars for daily offerings, often bread, beer, or incense. Temple festivals were the highlight of the year. Streets filled with music, dance, animal sacrifices, and processions of priests in colorful robes. These were moments of unity and reminders that the gods were watching. Marriage was sacred and practical. Most marriages were arranged. A contract was written, often involving dowries, terms of inheritance, and oaths. Weddings were celebrated with family feasts and blessings. Women were expected to be loyal and run the home, men to provide and protect. Divorce was legal, though complicated. Widows often remarried. Children were cherished, sons especially, but daughters too, for their value in marriage alliances. Justice was swift and visible. Disputes were brought to elders or temple courts. Hammurabi's code detailed harsh consequences. An eye for an eye, yes, but also rules about theft, debt, trade, and even medical errors. Contracts were everything, signed, witnessed, and stored on clay. To break one was to challenge not just law, but the gods themselves. In the evenings, people rested on rooftops or in courtyards, telling stories, singing songs, watching the stars. The Mesopotamians were early astronomers, mapping the sky with precision. They believed the heavens held messages, omens of floods, births, victories. Time was measured by the moon, and each day divided into hours, a concept they gave us. Their calendars guided farming and faith. Their sky-gazing would later inspire Babylonian and Greek astronomy. And through it all, from palace to field, the river was life. The Tigris and Euphrates gave water, fish, trade routes, and fertile soil. But they also brought destruction. Floods could ruin entire villages. So the Mesopotamians adapted. They built levees, dug canals, planned for disaster. Their entire civilization was a dance with nature, a constant act of balancing survival with creation. Mesopotamian life was not glamorous. There was disease, famine, war, injustice, but there was also community, creativity, and deep purpose. Because even if their names are lost to time, these everyday people, the potter, the farmer, the baker, the teacher, built the very foundations of civilization, not with conquests, but with clay, courage, and care. They did not rule. They did not fight for glory. But their hands shaped the world we live in. One field, one word, one prayer at a time. When the cradle of civilization grew silent, but never truly died. Every great story has an ending, and so too did the story of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the cradle of civilization. For thousands of years, this land flourished. It saw the rise of cities, the invention of writing, the birth of law, science, religion, empire. From Sumer to Babylon, from Assyria to Persia, each chapter added new heights to human achievement. But nothing lasts forever. The fall of Mesopotamia did not come in a single moment. It was not one battle, one king's mistake, or one enemy's arrival. It was slow, layered, a gradual unraveling, like a tapestry fraying thread by thread. Let's begin with conquest. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon peacefully, and with him began a new era. The Persians respected Mesopotamian traditions. They preserved temples, protected scribes, and even used cuneiform for administration. But Babylon was no longer independent. It was now a province of a larger empire. Then came Alexander the Great, who dreamt of making Babylon the capital of his world empire. But after his death in 323 BCE, chaos followed. His generals fought over his empire, and Babylon, caught in the middle, began to wither. Over the next centuries, Mesopotamia would be ruled by foreign empires: the Seleucids, Parthians, Romans, and eventually the Sassanid Persians. Each brought new rulers, new languages, new gods. Slowly, the old ways faded, but conquest was only part of the story. A greater enemy was time itself. The mighty rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, shifted course. Cities that once thrived near water found themselves far from it. Irrigation canals dried up. Farmlands turned to dust. Without food, trade collapsed. Without trade, cities emptied. And then came climate. Evidence suggests that parts of Mesopotamia suffered from long periods of drought and soil salinization. Overuse of irrigation left salt in the ground, reducing crop yields. Harvests shrank. Famines grew. People left their homes, searching for better land. Meanwhile, the language of the land, Sumerian and Akkadian, slowly disappeared. Greek and Aramaic took their place. The ancient gods, Enlil, Ishtar, Marduk, were replaced by foreign deities, and eventually by new monotheistic faiths. By the time of the Islamic conquest in the 7th century CE, Mesopotamia was already a ghost of its former self. The great ziggurats had crumbled. The palaces were dust. The clay tablets lay buried beneath centuries of earth. The cities, Uruk, Nineveh, Babylon, were silent. But silence is not the same as death. Though the physical cities vanished, the ideas born in Mesopotamia never disappeared. Writing, first invented on clay tablets, became the foundation of every culture that followed. Laws, contracts, records, all flowed from that first stylus pressed into wet clay. Mathematics, with its base 60 system, gave us the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, and astronomical calculations that guided calendars for millennia. Government, from city councils to kingship, was modeled on what the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians had already built. Even today, when we study the stars, we follow a path mapped by ancient Mesopotamian astronomers. When we speak of justice, we echo Hammurabi. When we write stories, we inherit a tradition that began with Gilgamesh, and the people, they never vanished either. The descendants of Mesopotamia still live in Iraq, Syria, Iran, and beyond. Their languages have changed. Their faiths have evolved. But their roots run deep, deeper than any temple, deeper than any river. In the 19th century, archaeologists began to uncover the secrets of this lost world. At Nineveh, they found Ashurbanipal's great library, thousands of tablets. At they unearthed royal tombs with gold, jewelry, and lyres. At Babylon, they stood among crumbling gates, still etched with lions and bulls. And from the earth, Mesopotamia spoke again. It told us its story, not of kings alone, but of people who farmed, wrote, prayed, built, dreamed. People who laid the foundation for everything we now call civilization. So yes, Mesopotamia fell. Its empires were conquered, its cities forgotten, but its legacy never ended. They say the rivers changed course, and the cities turned to dust. But in every book, every law, every star we name, Mesopotamia still flows. Where heaven met earth, and the divine walked among men, in the land between the rivers, where civilization was born, faith was not a belief. It was a way of life. The people of Mesopotamia did not separate the sacred from the everyday. The gods were in the fields, in the storms, in the markets, in the sky. They were everywhere, watching, judging, rewarding, and punishing. Life was unpredictable, and so too were the gods. And yet, in that unpredictability, the Mesopotamians found meaning. They created some of the world's earliest religious systems and mythologies, stories that explained the mysteries of the universe: life, death, love, and justice. Let's begin where all stories begin: creation. According to the Babylonian creation myth, the world began in a swirling, chaotic sea. There were two primeval gods: Apsu, the god of fresh water, and Tiamat, the goddess of salt water. From their union came younger gods, loud, unruly, and ambitious. Apsu wanted to silence them. But before he could, Ea, one of the young gods, struck first, killing Apsu. Tiamat, enraged, rose up in fury. From her body, she birthed terrifying monsters to destroy the younger gods. In the end, it was Marduk, the champion of Babylon, who answered the call. He battled Tiamat in a cosmic war. With his mighty winds and bow, he slew her and split her body in two, creating the sky and the earth. From her eyes flowed the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Then Marduk created humans, not out of love, but out of necessity. He fashioned mankind from the blood of a defeated god, so that humans would serve the gods, tend their temples, and carry their burdens. This creation story, known as the Enuma Elish, tells us much. To the Mesopotamians, the world was not born from harmony, but from conflict, sacrifice, and divine will. Humanity existed not as the center of the universe, but as servants in a greater cosmic order. And yet, they also believed humans could connect with the divine through rituals, offerings, and prayer. Each city had its patron deity. In Uruk, it was Inanna, goddess of love and war, fierce and passionate. In Nippur, it was Enlil, god of air and order. In Babylon, it was Marduk, the king of gods. And in the night sky, there was Nana, the moon god, guiding the months. Temples, called ziggurats, rose like mountains toward the heavens. These were not places for public worship like modern churches or mosques, but the homes of the gods. Only priests could enter the sacred inner chambers. There, they bathed and fed the statues of the gods each day, as if caring for royal guests. Religion in Mesopotamia was deeply ritualistic. There were prayers for planting and harvest, for childbirth and healing, for protection in war. People brought offerings, bread, beer, livestock, incense, in hopes of favor. Divination was common. Priests read omens in the stars, the liver of sacrificed animals, or the patterns of oil in water, searching for clues about the god's will. But behind these rituals were powerful myths. Perhaps the most famous was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving epic poem in human history. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was part god, part man, powerful, arrogant, searching for meaning. After the death of his friend Enkidu, he wandered the earth, seeking the secret to eternal life. He met Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood, sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A story eerily similar to Noah's Ark. But in the end, Gilgamesh learned that immortality was not for mortals. His destiny was not to live forever, but to build, to rule, to leave a legacy. The message was clear. Human life is fleeting, but what we build, what we create, can endure. This myth shaped Mesopotamian views of death and the afterlife. They did not believe in heaven or hell as rewards or punishments. Instead, all souls, whether rich or poor, good or evil, descended to the underworld, known as Kur or Irkala. It was a land of dust and shadows, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. The dead ate clay and drank stale water. There was no joy, only silence. Because of this bleak view, Mesopotamians focused on the here and now. A good life meant building a strong family, earning respect, honoring the gods, and leaving something behind. A name, a work of art, a wall, a tablet, a city. Still, they mourned deeply. Funerals included wailing, offerings, and rituals to protect the soul. Families would visit graves, pour water for the dead, and pray they rested in peace. Despite their harsh vision of the afterlife, hope was never lost. In their myths, gods descended into the underworld and returned, like Inanna, who faced death but came back transformed. These stories echoed the cycles of nature, of planting and harvest, birth and death, flood and renewal. Over time, Mesopotamian religion evolved. As new empires rose, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, old gods were reshaped, renamed, reimagined. But their influence never faded. The myth of the flood would appear in the Bible. The struggle between light and darkness would shape Zoroastrianism. The idea of divine justice would echo through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And today, when we look up at the stars, read our horoscopes, debate fate and free will, we're touching the same mysteries that priests and poets once tried to answer in the temples of Uruk, and Babylon. Their gods were not perfect. Their myths were not kind. But in every thunderstorm, every star, every dream of forever, the people of Mesopotamia found the divine. From clay tablets to code, from ziggurats to skylines, thousands of years have passed since the last bricks were laid in Babylon. The ziggurats have crumbled. The gods have fallen silent. The rivers have shifted, and the cities are buried beneath time and sand. And yet, Mesopotamia lives on. You may not see it, but it's there. In the way we write, measure time, build cities, govern societies, read contracts, count stars, and tell stories. The legacy of Mesopotamia is not a museum piece. It is the foundation of the modern world. Let's begin with the most powerful gift of all: writing. In the cities of Sumer, over 5,000 years ago, someone pressed a reed stylus into a wet slab of clay. They weren't writing poetry, they were recording grain deliveries. But from that small act came a revolution, the invention of cuneiform, the first true writing system. Writing changed everything. It allowed humans to remember across generations, to record laws, prayers, trade, history, and dreams. The earliest dictionaries, receipts, medical texts, and literary works were all born in Mesopotamia. Today, every contract, constitution, novel, and message you send carries that original spark. The desire to preserve words beyond the moment. Next, the law, the Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone nearly 4,000 years ago, was more than a list of punishments. It was a declaration that justice could be written, seen, and applied. An eye for an eye may sound harsh today, but it was revolutionary then. It meant laws applied to everyone, not just the powerful. Hammurabi's code introduced the idea of a government accountable to its people, a principle that echoes in every modern legal system. Then there's mathematics and time. Mesopotamians counted in base 60, a system we still use today. That's why hours have 60 minutes, and circles have 360 degrees. They developed advanced geometry and algebra, calculated the areas of land, and even estimated the square root of 2. Their astronomers tracked the movements of stars and planets with astonishing precision. They divided the year into 12 months based on lunar cycles and created calendars to guide farming, festivals, and fate. Today, our clocks, compasses, and calendars are built on those ancient calculations. Let's talk about urban life. Mesopotamia gave us the first cities: Uruk, Nippur, Babylon. These were not just clusters of homes. They had roads, marketplaces, sewage systems, courtyards, temples, schools, and zoning laws. They created the concept of urban planning, of shared public spaces, of specialized labor, the division between farmer and craftsman, trader and teacher, all began here. Today's cities, with their mayors, districts, and infrastructure, are descendants of those early experiments. And in government, Mesopotamia introduced the world to bureaucracy. Not the kind we joke about, but the essential machinery of state: taxation, record-keeping, logistics. They understood that an empire needs more than soldiers. It needs systems, from the satraps of Persia to the governors of modern nations. The structure of rule we live under today finds its ancient roots along the Tigris and Euphrates. But perhaps the most beautiful legacy of Mesopotamia is the story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, is the oldest surviving epic poem in human history. It's a tale of kingship, friendship, love, loss, and the search for immortality. Themes as human today as they were 4,000 years ago. In Gilgamesh, we see the eternal struggle. What does it mean to be human? What lasts after we die? How do we face grief, fate, and time? That epic inspired the stories that came after. The Bible, the Iliad, the Aeneid, the Mahabharata. Every time we tell a story about a hero who changes, about life and death, we are continuing the tradition begun in ancient Mesopotamia. Even religion, the very shape of our spirituality, was touched by Mesopotamia. The myth of a great flood, the battle between good and evil, the judgment after death, the sacredness of written law. All these ideas appear first in Mesopotamian myth and later evolve in the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They are echoes of ziggurats, temples, and sky-watching priests. Echoes that continue in churches, mosques, and synagogues around the world. And so, while the empires of Mesopotamia have vanished, while the lions of Babylon no longer guard its gates, while the names of kings like Sargon and Ashurbanipal gather dust in history books, their legacy endures. In classrooms, we study their systems. In libraries, we preserve their writings. In science, we expand on their numbers. In faith, we echo their questions. And in stories, always in stories, they live again, because civilization is not one moment. It is a river flowing from one generation to the next. And Mesopotamia was the source, the spring where it all began. They carved on clay. We type on glass. They raised ziggurats. We build towers. They feared gods. We search the stars. But in every step we take forward, we walk the ancient paths of Mesopotamia.